The screaming stopped at exactly 11:47 a.m. on Christmas morning, 1851, when the roof of St. Augustine's Church in Natchez, Mississippi, came down like the fist of an angry god. 67 people died in those first 12 seconds. Men in their finest suits, women in silk dresses imported from Paris, children clutching new toys they'd opened just hours before. The church's massive oak beams, each weighing over 300 pounds, fell with such force that they drove bodies straight through the floorboards into the crawl space below. When rescuers finally dug through the rubble 3 days later, they found something that made even the hardest men turn away and vomit. The bodies weren't just crushed. They were compressed, flattened, merged together in ways that made it impossible to tell where one person ended and another began. But here's what the newspapers never reported, what the town deliberately erased from every official record. Standing in the churchyard as the building collapsed, watching through the stained glass windows as the ceiling came down on the heads of Natchez's wealthiest families, was a 42-year-old enslaved man named Samuel. And he wasn't screaming. He was smiling. Because 8 months earlier, on a sweltering April morning, these same people had gathered in this same church to watch Samuel's 14-year-old son, Isaiah, get whipped to death on the church steps for the crime of looking a white man in the eye. Before we continue with this story of patience, precision, and the most calculated act of vengeance in American slavery history, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and comment below what city or state you're listening from. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a piece of American history that powerful people spent over a century trying to erase, and your engagement keeps these forgotten truths alive. Natchez, Mississippi in 1851 sat like a jewel on the bluffs overlooking the great river. The city was drowning in cotton wealth. 2nd Street was lined with mansions so grand that European visitors compared them to palaces. The slave market downtown operated 6 days a week, selling human beings like livestock while church bells rang out over the city every Sunday morning, calling the faithful to worship the same God who supposedly said all men were created equal. St. Augustine's Church stood at the heart of white Natchez society. Built in 1832 with Greek Revival columns and a soaring steeple visible for miles, it was where the wealthy came to see and be seen, to display their finest clothes and newest slaves, to pray for continued prosperity while ignoring the human cost of their fortunes. Reverend Cornelius Whitfield preached there every Sunday, his sermons carefully calibrated to reassure his congregation that slavery was God's will, that the natural order placed white men at the top and everyone else below. Samuel had been born in what is now Senegal in 1809, stolen during a raid when he was 12 years old, and sold in Charleston 3 months later after a middle passage that killed half the people chained beside him in the ship's hold. He was purchased by Thomas Blackwood, a Natchez cotton planter who recognized something valuable in the boy's quick mind and strong hands. By the time Samuel was 20, he'd taught himself carpentry by watching the plantation's white craftsmen, memorizing their techniques, practicing in secret with stolen tools. By 30, he was the most skilled carpenter in Adams County, building everything from furniture to entire house frames. His work was so good that white contractors would hire him out from Blackwood, paying top dollar for Samuel's expertise, while Samuel himself saw none of the money. That's how Samuel met Isaiah's mother, Rebecca. She was a house slave on the Whitmore plantation, and Samuel was there building a new wing onto the main house. They married in the slave quarters without permission, knowing their union had no legal standing, knowing their children would be born into bondage, but loving each other anyway, because love was one of the few things slavery couldn't completely destroy. Isaiah was born in 1837, and from the moment he drew his first breath, Samuel made a decision: He would teach his son everything. Not just how to survive, but how to think, how to read the world around him, how to see the structures that others took for granted. He taught Isaiah to understand wood and stone, to see how buildings were put together, to recognize which beams bore weight and which were merely decorative. He did this in whispers during the few hours they had together, in stolen moments when the overseers weren't watching, in coding lessons in stories about African kings and clever animals who outwitted stronger predators. Isaiah grew tall and bright, with his mother's quick smile and his father's careful, observant eyes. He was too smart for his own good, the other slaves would whisper. Asking too many questions, reading white folks' faces too openly, forgetting sometimes to lower his gaze and shuffle his feet. Rebecca tried to teach him the mask all enslaved people had to wear, the performance of submission that kept you alive. But Isaiah struggled with it. At 14, he stood nearly 6 feet tall, with hands that were already learning his father's craft, and a mind that refused to accept the world as it was. April 15th, 1851 started like any other Sunday. Samuel was finishing repairs on St. Augustine's church, work that had been ongoing for 3 months. The church's building committee, led by Thomas Blackwood himself, had hired Samuel to reinforce the structure, to add new support beams in the attic, to ensure the aging building could stand for another 50 years. Samuel worked 6 days a week on the project, often alone in the church's upper reaches, learning every inch of the building's anatomy, understanding exactly how it held itself up against gravity's constant pull. That morning, Samuel was at the church early, completing some detail work on the interior trim. Isaiah had come with him, helping carry tools, learning his father's trade. They were working in comfortable silence when the sound of horses and shouting erupted outside. Through the church windows, Samuel saw a crowd gathering. White men on horseback, plantation owners in their Sunday clothes, a growing mob of spectators. In the center of the commotion was a young white man named Charles Whitmore, son of one of Natchez' wealthiest families, and he was screaming about disrespect, about a slave who'd dared to meet his eyes on the street that morning, who'd failed to step off the boardwalk fast enough. Samuel's blood went cold when he realized Charles was describing Isaiah. His son had been running an errand for Thomas Blackwood, carrying a message to another plantation owner downtown. The boy had been rushing, focused on his task, and hadn't noticed Charles approaching until it was too late. Their eyes had met for perhaps 2 seconds. That was all. 2 seconds of accidental eye contact. But in Natchez in 1851, that was enough. Samuel dropped his tools and ran outside, but hands grabbed him before he'd gone 10 steps. "Don't you move, Samuel," a voice hissed in his ear. It was Blackwood himself, holding Samuel's arm with an iron grip. "You'll only make it worse for him." Samuel watched, held in place by his owner, as they dragged Isaiah up the church steps. The boy was terrified, but trying not to show it, maintaining the dignity his parents had tried to teach him. Charles Whitmore stood at the top of the steps, his face red with manufactured rage, playing to the growing crowd. "This is what happens when they forget their place," Charles announced, his voice carrying across the churchyard. "When they think they're equal to us. When they look us in the eye like they're men." Reverend Whitfield emerged from the church, drawn by the commotion. For one desperate moment, Samuel thought the Reverend might intervene, might speak words of mercy and Christian compassion. Instead, Whitfield nodded gravely and said, "The Bible is clear. Slaves must obey their masters. This correction is unfortunate but necessary." They tied Isaiah to the church's iron railing, the same railing that wealthy white families used to steady themselves as they climbed the steps in their fine shoes. 20 lashes, Charles Whitmore announced. That was the standard punishment for disrespect. But Charles was young and drunk on power and eager to impress the watching crowd. He swung the whip himself, refusing to let an overseer do it. The first lash tore Isaiah's shirt. The second drew blood. By the fifth, the boy's back was a mess of torn flesh. Samuel fought against Blackwood's grip, but two more white men had joined in holding him, and his owner's voice was in his ear. "You move, you die, and then who'll take care of Rebecca? You swallow this, Samuel. You swallow it, and you live." So Samuel stood there and watched his son die. Because that's what happened. Charles Whitmore didn't stop at 20 lashes. The crowd was cheering, bloodlust rising, and he kept going. 30 lashes. 40. Isaiah stopped screaming around the 25th lash. By the 40th, he hung limp from his bonds. They cut him down at 57 lashes, and his body crumpled on the church steps like a broken doll. He was still breathing, but Samuel could see the light leaving his son's eyes. Isaiah looked at his father one last time, and in that look was forgiveness for not being able to stop this, was love despite everything, was goodbye. Isaiah died 4 hours later in the slave quarters, his mother holding him as his life bled out from wounds too severe for any human body to survive. Rebecca didn't cry. She'd gone somewhere beyond tears, beyond sound, beyond anything that looked like grief to outsiders. She just held their son and rocked him and hummed the lullabies she'd sung when he was a baby. Samuel sat beside them, his face carved from stone, his eyes seeing something no one else could see. When Isaiah finally stopped breathing, Samuel gently closed his son's eyes, kissed his forehead, and stood up. "I need to go finish some work at the church," he said quietly. Rebecca looked at him with eyes that had aged 1,000 years in 4 hours. "Samuel," she whispered, "don't do something that'll get you killed too. I can't lose you both." Samuel touched her face with a tenderness that made her chest ache. "You won't lose me," he said. "I promise you that." He didn't tell her what he was planning. He didn't tell anyone. That night, while the rest of the slave quarters grieved, while Rebecca sat in silent shock, while Thomas Blackwood slept soundly in his great house, satisfied that proper order had been maintained, Samuel returned to St. Augustine's Church. He had keys. He'd been given them months ago to facilitate his repair work, trusted completely because he'd spent 22 years building a reputation as a reliable, submissive slave who did good work and never caused trouble. He let himself in through the side door and climbed up to the attic space above the main sanctuary. The church's structure was beautiful in its simplicity. The roof's massive weight was supported by a series of oak beams, each one hewn from trees that had stood for over a century before being cut down and shaped. These beams ran the length of the building, resting on the exterior walls and on 6 massive support columns that rose from the foundation. It was solid construction, built to last generations. But Samuel understood something that the church's builders perhaps hadn't fully considered. Every structure has points of critical failure. Remove the right support, and the whole thing comes down. Over the next 8 months, Samuel became a ghost. He continued his regular work, continued being the reliable carpenter everyone trusted. But inside he was transformed into something else. Something patient and calculating, and absolutely focused. Every night, after the plantation was asleep, he would slip away to the church. Sometimes he could only stay for an hour before the risk of discovery grew too great. Sometimes he had the whole night. He worked in complete darkness, tools wrapped in cloth to muffle their sound, every movement careful and deliberate. He started with the 6 main support columns. These were massive timber posts, nearly 2 feet square, running from floor to ceiling. Samuel didn't cut them. That would be too obvious. Instead, he drilled into them from the back, where the damage wouldn't be visible from the sanctuary floor. He used a brace and bit, slowly boring holes deep into the heart of each column, weakening them from the inside while leaving the outer shell intact. Each hole was precisely placed, angled to maximize structural damage while remaining invisible to casual inspection. The work was excruciating. The oak was dense and hard, resisting every turn of the drill. His hands blistered and bled. His shoulders burned from the repetitive motion. But every time he felt like stopping, he would see Isaiah's face, would remember his son's broken body on those church steps, and his hands would find new strength. He drilled hundreds of holes over those months, gradually hollowing out the columns like a termite infestation, leaving them standing but fundamentally compromised. Then he moved to the main support beams in the attic. These were even more critical to the building's integrity. Samuel couldn't simply cut through them. That would cause immediate collapse and likely kill him in the process. Instead, he used a technique he'd learned years ago for weakening timber that needed to be removed. He made careful cuts on the underside of each beam, deep notches that reduced their load-bearing capacity by 60, 70, sometimes 80%. But he was surgical about it, cutting only as much as necessary to ensure failure under maximum load while leaving enough intact that the structure wouldn't collapse prematurely. He also understood something about wood that most people didn't. It's not just the cuts that matter, but how the remaining wood is stressed. He made his cuts in patterns that would cause the beams to fail in a specific sequence, creating a cascade effect where one failure would immediately trigger the next. The roof would come down not in one piece, but in a progressive collapse, each section falling faster than the last, maximizing both the destruction and the impossibility of escape. As he worked, Samuel had time to think. Long, dark hours alone in that church gave him space to consider what he was doing, to question whether this was justice or merely revenge, to wonder if killing dozens of people made him as monstrous as the system that had killed his son. He thought about Rebecca, about how this would affect her if he were caught, about whether this was what Isaiah would have wanted. But then he would remember Charles Whitmore's laugh as the whip came down, would remember Reverend Whitfield's sanctimonious nod of approval, would remember how the crowd had cheered as his son died on the steps of God's house, and his doubts would vanish. This wasn't random violence. Every person who would be in that church when it fell had been complicit in Isaiah's death. They had watched or cheered or simply accepted it as the natural order of things. They had gone home to their fine dinners and soft beds while Isaiah's body cooled in the slave quarters. They had slept peacefully while Rebecca's heart shattered. They represented a system so evil, so fundamentally wrong, that it could watch a child be beaten to death and call it righteousness. Samuel realized something during those long nights. He wasn't becoming a monster. He was becoming an instrument of something larger than himself. A tool of justice in a world where justice was denied to people who looked like him. He was doing what the law would never do, what God apparently wouldn't do, what needed to be done so that Isaiah's death meant something. By October, the structural work was complete. The church looked exactly as it always had, but it was now a trap waiting to be sprung. The columns stood straight and solid to any visual inspection, but inside they were Swiss cheese, barely holding together. The roof beams showed no obvious damage from below, but they'd been reduced to perhaps 30% of their original strength. Samuel calculated that the structure could support its normal weight. The roof itself, some snow, perhaps a dozen people scattered throughout the building. But fill the church to capacity, pack the pews with well-fed, wealthy families in their heavy winter clothes. Add the vibration of movement and singing and the reverend's thunderous voice, and the whole thing would come down. But Samuel wasn't done, because he didn't just want the church to collapse. He wanted it to collapse at a specific moment, on a specific day, when it would send the most powerful possible message. He wanted it to fall on Christmas. The symbolism was perfect. Christmas, when wealthy white Christians celebrated the birth of their Savior while enslaving millions of people. Christmas, when they sang hymns about peace and goodwill while resting their feet on the backs of the oppressed. Christmas, when they thanked God for their blessings without acknowledging that those blessings were built on stolen labor and broken families. Samuel wanted them to die on Christmas, in their church, celebrating their Christ, at the moment when they felt most righteous and blessed. He wanted God's house to become their tomb. But he had a problem. He'd weakened the structure as much as he dared, but he couldn't guarantee it would fail exactly when he wanted it to. Wood is unpredictable, especially old oak. The church might stand for days or even weeks beyond his calculations, or it might come down too early, on some random Tuesday morning when the building was empty except for the cleaning staff. He needed a trigger, something that would ensure collapse at the precise moment of maximum impact. The solution came to him in November, during the first cold snap of the season. He was watching the church building from a distance, studying it like an enemy fortress, when he noticed how the structure responded to temperature changes. Wood expands and contracts with heat and humidity. In cold weather, the beams would shrink slightly, increasing stress on the joints and connections. If he could combine that natural temperature stress with additional strategic weakening, he might be able to create a precise failure point. Samuel began making final adjustments. He identified 3 specific beams whose failure would trigger the cascade he wanted. These beams were already weakened, but he needed to push them just a bit further. He developed a technique using thin metal wedges. He would drive these wedges into the cuts he'd already made, gradually forcing the remaining wood apart, increasing the internal stress. The brilliant part was that he could do this incrementally. Each night, he would tap the wedges a bit deeper, slowly bringing the beams to the point of failure without actually breaking them. He could calibrate the timing, bringing the structure right to the edge and then stopping, leaving it balanced on a knife's edge. By mid-December, everything was ready. The church was a bomb waiting for someone to light the fuse. Samuel had spent 8 months turning a symbol of white Christian power into a death trap so sophisticated that even if someone discovered it after the collapse, they might think it was simply structural failure due to age and poor maintenance. There was no evidence of sabotage that would survive the collapse itself. The drilled holes would be crushed and scattered. The cut beams would be shattered. The wedges would be buried under tons of rubble. It would look like a terrible accident. God's will, some might even say. But Samuel had one more thing to do. He needed to ensure maximum attendance on Christmas morning. Because while he knew the church would be crowded, he wanted to guarantee that everyone who deserved to be there would be present. This is where 8 months of playing the submissive, trusted slave paid off in ways Samuel had never anticipated. Thomas Blackwood, his owner, was on the church's building committee. 3 nights before Christmas, Samuel approached him with apparent concern. "Master Blackwood, sir," Samuel said, using the deferential tone he'd perfected over decades. "I've been thinking about that church, sir. The work I did there. I want to make sure everything's solid before the Christmas service. That's going to be a powerful lot of people in there." Blackwood looked at Samuel with something like affection. In the 8 months since Isaiah's death, Samuel had been the perfect slave. Quiet, hard-working, showing no anger or resentment. Blackwood had even commented to other owners about how Samuel had accepted his loss with appropriate Christian resignation. "The church is fine, Samuel," Blackwood said. "You did excellent work there." "I know, sir," Samuel replied, "but I'd feel better if I could do one final inspection. Make sure all them beams is solid. Wouldn't want nothing to happen during service, not with all the important families there. Not with your family there, sir." That did it. Blackwood's wife and 3 children would be at the Christmas service, along with everyone else who mattered in Natchez society. The thought of any risk, however small, concerned him. "All right," Blackwood agreed. "You can do a final inspection on Christmas Eve. But make it quick. Don't disrupt the decorating." Samuel thanked him profusely and shuffled away. The picture of a concerned, simple-minded slave worried about his master's safety. Inside, his heart was racing, because that final inspection would give him the opportunity to make the last crucial adjustments, to drive those wedges that final fraction of an inch, to set the exact timing of failure. On Christmas Eve, while the church was being decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, while the altar was being draped with expensive fabric and candles were being positioned to create a beautiful glow, Samuel moved through the building one last time. He went up to the attic and found his 3 critical beams. Using a small mallet and extreme care, he drove each wedge exactly 3 more taps deeper. He could feel the wood under tremendous stress, could sense how close it was to failure. He calculated based on everything he knew about wood and weight and physics. The beams would hold through Christmas Eve, through the night, through the early morning. But once the church filled with people, once the organ started playing, once hundreds of feet were moving and dozens of voices were singing, once the Reverend started his sermon in his characteristic booming voice that made the whole building resonate, the vibrations and weight would push those beams past their breaking point. He estimated failure would occur between 15 and 30 minutes into the service, after the opening hymns, after everyone was settled and comfortable, after they'd begun to relax into the familiar rhythms of Christmas worship. That's when God's house would come down on their heads. Samuel climbed down from the attic for the last time. He walked through the sanctuary, looking at the pews where he'd never been allowed to sit, at the altar where enslaved people couldn't approach, at the beautiful stained glass windows depicting Bible stories that were used to justify his bondage. He thought about Isaiah, about how his son had died on the steps outside for the crime of being human, of having eyes that could see, of forgetting for 2 seconds to perform the theater of subservience. "This is for you," Samuel whispered to the empty church. "For you and for every child who died under the whip. For every mother who watched her baby sold away. For every father who couldn't protect his family. For every soul crushed by these people and their God who looks away." Then he locked the doors and went home to Rebecca. She was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, like she'd done every night since Isaiah's death. Samuel sat beside her and took her hand. "Tomorrow's Christmas," he said quietly. "Tomorrow everything changes." Rebecca looked at him, and something in his tone made her focus. "Samuel, what did you do?" He met her eyes steadily. What needed to be done? What Isaiah would have wanted. Tomorrow, when that church is full of the people who killed our son, when they're singing their Christmas hymns and thanking their God for their blessings, that building is going to fall. Everyone inside is going to die. And I'm going to watch it happen. Rebecca's hand flew to her mouth. For a long moment, she just stared at him, horror and understanding, and something else battling in her expression. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "Will they know it was you?" "No," Samuel said. I've been too careful. It'll look like the building just failed. Poor maintenance, age, too much weight, an accident. But you'll know, Rebecca whispered. You'll carry that weight forever. I've been carrying the weight of Isaiah's death for 8 months, Samuel replied. This won't make it heavier. It'll make it bearable. It'll mean he didn't die for nothing. They sat together in silence for a long time. Finally, Rebecca squeezed his hand. I won't stop you, she said. God forgive me, but I won't stop you. Those people took everything from us. They took our son, and they smiled while they did it. If there's any justice in this world, even a cold and terrible justice, then maybe this is it. Christmas morning broke cold and clear. The temperature had dropped overnight, causing the wood in St. Augustine's church to contract slightly, adding just a bit more stress to those critically weakened beams. Samuel woke early and told Thomas Blackwood he was feeling ill, that his stomach was troubled. Blackwood, in a generous Christmas mood, told Samuel to rest, that the work could wait until tomorrow. Samuel stayed in the slave quarters while the Blackwood family prepared for church. He watched them dress in their finest clothes, watched the children excited about the special Christmas service, watched Thomas help his wife into the carriage. Then he slipped away. He made his way to the church through back paths, staying out of sight. Other enslaved people were heading to their own Christmas gathering in a small building near the slave market, a space grudgingly provided for their separate worship. Samuel nodded to people he knew, but didn't stop to talk. He had somewhere to be. He positioned himself in a grove of trees about 50 yards from the church, close enough to see clearly, but far enough away to be overlooked in the general Christmas morning bustle. From this vantage point, he could see the church steps, the same steps where Isaiah had died 8 months ago. There was no stain, no mark, nothing to indicate that a child's life had ended there. The church had simply washed away the blood and continued as if nothing had happened. People started arriving around 10:30. The service was scheduled for 11, but the wealthy arrived early to see and be seen, to show off new dresses and jewelry, to exchange Christmas greetings with their social equals. Samuel watched them climb those steps in their finery, watched them smile and laugh and wish each other Merry Christmas. He saw Charles Whitmore arrive with his family, the young man who'd swung the whip, now looking prosperous and respectable in his Sunday suit. He saw Reverend Whitfield greeting people at the door, his face beaming with Christmas joy. He saw Thomas Blackwood and his family enter, his owner's wife beautiful in a new blue dress, the children excited and well-behaved. He saw dozens of other families, hundreds of people in total, all of Natchez' white elite gathering in one place at one time. They were all there. Every single person who'd watched Isaiah die, who'd participated in that murder through action or approval or simple acceptance. They were all walking into his trap, smiling and laughing, completely unaware that they were entering their tomb. The church was packed beyond capacity. Every pew was full, with people standing along the walls and in the back. Samuel estimated close to 300 people inside, maybe more. The weight on those weakened beams must be tremendous, he thought. The structure was holding, but just barely. At exactly 11 o'clock, the organ began to play. The opening hymn rose from inside the church, voices raised in praise. Samuel could hear them singing Joy to the World, their voices carrying across the churchyard. Joy to the world, the Lord is come. Let earth receive her King. The irony was so sharp, it could cut. These people singing about the Prince of Peace, about a God who sided with the poor and oppressed while building their wealth on the backs of enslaved human beings. They sang, and the building vibrated with their voices. Samuel could see the windows shaking slightly. could imagine the stress waves traveling through the structure, testing those weakened beams. The hymn ended, and Reverend Whitfield began his sermon. Samuel couldn't hear all the words, but he caught phrases that drifted out. Blessed season of giving, grateful for God's bounty, natural order of society, Christmas blessings. The sermon went on. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Samuel began to worry that he'd miscalculated, that the structure was stronger than he'd thought, that it would hold through the service, and he'd have to try again some other time. Then he heard it. A sound like a gunshot, sharp and clear, even from 50 yards away. It was the first beam failing, the wood finally surrendering to stress it could no longer bear. Inside the church, people must have heard it too, must have looked up in confusion. But they had no time to react, because once that first beam failed, the cascade began exactly as Samuel had planned. He watched through the windows as the ceiling sagged, heard more cracks, louder now, coming in rapid succession like cannon fire. Saw the stained glass windows bulge outward from the pressure of air being compressed inside. The collapse took 12 seconds from first crack to complete destruction. The roof came down first, those massive oak beams falling with thousands of pounds of wooden shingles and rafters. The beams fell at an angle, creating a progressive collapse from the front of the church toward the back. The front rows were crushed instantly. The people in the back had perhaps 3 seconds of consciousness to understand what was happening, to see death falling toward them, to open their mouths to scream. But 3 seconds isn't enough time to reach the doors, isn't enough time to escape. The beams smashed down onto the pews, which collapsed under the impact. The floor gave way in sections, unable to support the sudden concentration of weight. Bodies fell through into the crawl space beneath the church. Then the walls, no longer supported by the roof structure, began to fail. The beautiful Greek revival columns cracked and toppled. The walls buckled inward, adding their weight to the carnage. Within 12 seconds, St. Augustine's Church had been transformed from a symbol of white Christian power into a pile of rubble and broken bodies. The screaming stopped at exactly 11:47 a.m. Not because everyone was dead, not yet, but because the people who were still alive were trapped under crushing weight, unable to draw breath to scream. Some died instantly from falling beams striking their heads or chests. Others died slowly, crushed under tons of wood and stone, suffocating in the dust and darkness. A few survived the initial collapse, only to bleed out from terrible injuries, their cries growing weaker as the minutes passed. Samuel watched it all. He stood in his grove of trees and witnessed the complete destruction of the building and everyone inside it. He saw dust rise like smoke from the rubble, heard the groans of settling wood and the faint cries of the dying. Watched as people from the street began running toward the collapsed church, their faces masks of horror. He felt no joy, no satisfaction, no triumph. What he felt was a terrible, hollow sense of completion. It was done. Isaiah's death had been answered. The people who'd killed his son were now dead themselves, crushed under the house of the God they'd used to justify their cruelty. Justice, cold and final, had been served. But then something unexpected happened. As the dust began to settle, as people started digging frantically through the rubble, as screams of horror rose from those discovering what lay beneath, Samuel saw movement in the slave quarters gathering place. The enslaved people who'd been having their own Christmas service had heard the collapse. They were emerging from their building, staring at the destruction, and Samuel saw something in their faces that he hadn't anticipated. Not just shock, not just fear, but understanding. They knew, somehow they knew, that this wasn't an accident. They didn't know who had done it or how, but they recognized this as an act of resistance, of vengeance, of power reclaimed. Samuel saw old Moses, who'd been enslaved for 60 years, look at the collapsed church and smile. Saw young Mary, who'd watched her baby sold away last year, cover her mouth not in horror, but to suppress something that might have been laughter. Saw Jacob, who bore scars on his back from 1,000 lashes, straighten his shoulders like a weight had been lifted. The enslaved people of Natchez understood in that moment what the white survivors would never admit: that the powerless had struck back, that someone had said enough, that the natural order of oppression could be challenged and overturned, that there was a limit to what human beings would endure before they fought back in any way they could. Samuel watched the rescue efforts for another hour. They pulled 67 bodies from the wreckage that day. Another 12 people would die from their injuries over the next week. Thomas Blackwood was among the dead, crushed under a beam along with his entire family. Charles Whitmore was found with his skull caved in, his face frozen in an expression of terror. Reverend Whitfield was discovered near the altar, his body so mangled that they identified him only by his wedding ring. The children died too, innocent in their own way. But Samuel couldn't bring himself to feel guilt about that. Those children would have grown up to be the next generation of masters, would have inherited their parents' wealth and prejudices, would have continued the system. In ending them, he'd prevented future suffering for other children like Isaiah. The investigation was swift and cursory. Structural failure due to age and poor maintenance, the officials concluded. They didn't want to look deeper, didn't want to consider other possibilities, because those possibilities were too frightening. The idea that an enslaved person could plan and execute such destruction, could outsmart them all, could strike such a devastating blow against white power, that idea was intolerable. Better to believe it was an accident, an act of God, a terrible tragedy with no human agency behind it. Samuel returned to the slave quarters that afternoon. Rebecca was waiting for him, and when she saw his face, she knew. She held him while he finally allowed himself to cry, not from grief, but from the release of 8 months of carefully controlled fury. "Is it done?" she whispered. "It's done," Samuel replied. "They're gone, all of them." They held each other in silence, two people who'd lost everything and gained nothing but the cold comfort of vengeance. In the days that followed, Samuel waited for someone to accuse him, to examine the church ruins more closely, to discover the evidence of deliberate sabotage. But no one did. The white community was too shocked, too busy with funerals and rebuilding their lives. The enslaved community kept their suspicions to themselves, protecting whoever had done this, honoring what they recognized as an act of resistance. Samuel continued his work, continued being the reliable carpenter, showing appropriate sadness about the tragedy, but no particular emotion beyond that. He was questioned briefly. Everyone who'd worked on the church was. But his decades of playing the submissive slave served him well. "It's terrible, Master," he told the investigators. "I did my best with them repairs. But that building was old. I'm so sorry I couldn't prevent this tragedy." They believed him because they wanted to believe him, because the alternative was too dangerous to contemplate. The story should end there, with Samuel getting away with the perfect crime, with justice coldly served, with the oppressed striking back against their oppressors. But history is messier than stories, and the consequences of that Christmas morning echoed for years. Samuel lived for another 23 years, dying in 1874 at the age of 65. He never confessed, never told anyone outside Rebecca what he'd done. But he also never did carpentry work again. He couldn't. Every time he picked up his tools, he saw the church collapsing, heard the screams, felt the weight of 67 deaths. He asked Thomas Blackwood's widow, who inherited the estate, to assign him to field work instead. She agreed, puzzled but willing, and Samuel spent his remaining years doing the back-breaking labor of cotton picking, work that was harder but simpler, that didn't require him to think about structures and weight and collapse. Rebecca never forgave him, but she never left him either. They stayed together until her death in 1869, bound by shared grief and shared guilt, by the memory of Isaiah and the terrible vengeance that followed. She would sometimes wake screaming from nightmares about children crushed under falling beams, and Samuel would hold her and say nothing because there was nothing to say. The enslaved community of Natchez never spoke openly about what happened. But the story passed down through generations in whispered conversations, in coded spirituals, in the way people would glance at church buildings and wonder. When the Emancipation Proclamation came in 1863, when freedom finally arrived after generations of bondage, old folks would sit with young folks and tell them stories about resistance, about the ways enslaved people fought back against impossible odds. And sometimes, in those tellings, there would be a story about a man who lost his son to white cruelty and made white people pay on Christmas morning, who turned their own church into their grave, who proved that the powerless could strike back with precision and patience. The white community of Natchez rebuilt St. Augustine's church, bigger and grander than before. They installed it with steel support beams this time, refusing to admit even to themselves why that precaution seemed necessary. They held services there for decades, never quite able to shake the feeling that something was wrong with the building, that the ground it stood on was somehow cursed. The church was finally demolished in 1923, not because of structural problems, but because the congregation never felt comfortable there. In the 1890s, when scholars started collecting oral histories from formerly enslaved people, an old woman named Sarah, who'd been a child in Natchez during slavery, told a story about Christmas of 1851. "We all knew," she said. "We didn't know who done it or exactly how, but we knew it wasn't no accident. We knew one of us had struck back. And for a while, a little while, we walked taller. Because we understood that we wasn't completely powerless, that there were ways to fight back, even in chains, that patience and planning could be weapons just as powerful as any gun." The interviewer asked her if she knew who was responsible. "If I did know," Sarah replied, "I wouldn't tell you. Some secrets need to stay secret. Some heroes need to stay hidden. Because the white folks, they can't never know for sure that we capable of that kind of planning, that kind of patience, that kind of cold justice. They need to believe we simple, we emotional. We can't think ahead. The moment they know different, the moment they understand what we really capable of, everything changes. So no, sir. I don't know who done it. But whoever it was, I hope they died knowing they'd done something that mattered. That they'd made white folks afraid, even if just for a moment. That they'd shown we wasn't animals or children or property. We was people. And people, when you push them too far, people fight back." The full truth about Samuel's actions remained hidden until 2003, when a historian researching property records in Natchez found Rebecca's diary, which had been stored in an old trunk in the attic of a house built on the former Blackwood plantation. Rebecca had taught herself to write in the years after Isaiah's death, and she'd kept a secret journal, writing down everything about what Samuel had done, about how he'd planned it, about the 8 months of careful sabotage. She'd hidden the diary carefully, never intending for anyone to read it in her lifetime. but unable to let the truth die completely. In her final entry, dated 3 days before her death in 1869, Rebecca wrote, "Samuel is in the fields today. His hands that once created such beautiful things now do simple labor. And maybe that's better. Maybe God don't want us to use our gifts for destruction, even when that destruction is righteous. I don't know if what Samuel done was right. I know it was justice. I know our son's death was answered. I know 67 white people died for killing one black child, and if that's wrong, then the whole world is wrong, because there gotta be some kind of balance, some kind of answer to all this suffering. But I also know Samuel ain't been the same since. He carried them deaths with him every day. He saved us, maybe. Saved all the black folks in Natchez by showing that we could strike back. But he lost himself in the doing of it. So I write this down so somebody, someday, will know the truth. Will know that my husband was a good man who was pushed too far. That he loved his son so much he was willing to become something terrible to avenge him. That he gave up his soul so that other black children might have a chance at life. I don't know if that's heroism or tragedy or both. I just know it's the truth. And the truth needs to be known, even if it takes 100 years for anyone to find these words. The diary caused controversy when it was discovered. Some historians disputed its authenticity. Others argued that even if it was real, publicizing it was wrong, that it would be used to justify racism and fear of black people. But others, particularly black scholars, argued that Samuel's story needed to be told because it revealed a truth about American slavery that white history had always tried to hide. That enslaved people were not passive victims. They were human beings who resisted in every way they could, who fought back with whatever tools they had, who refused to accept their bondage even when resistance seemed hopeless. Samuel's story wasn't about all enslaved people. Most never had the opportunity or ability to strike back so dramatically. But his story mattered because it showed what was possible, what could be accomplished with intelligence and patience and absolute commitment. Today, if you visit Natchez, there's no marker for St. Augustine's Church. The site is now a parking lot, and most people who park there have no idea what happened on that ground on Christmas morning in 1851. But in some black families in Natchez, in some communities that trace their ancestry back to slavery times, Samuel's story is still told. Not openly, not often, but told nonetheless. Told as a reminder that resistance took many forms. Told as proof that even in the darkest times, even under the most complete oppression, human beings found ways to fight back. Told as a warning to anyone who thinks they can brutalize others without consequence. Because Samuel proved something important, that patience is a weapon, that intelligence is a tool of resistance, that someone who appears powerless can be planning your destruction. He proved that you can enslave a man's body, but if his mind remains free, if his will remains unbroken, he becomes something more dangerous than any rebel with a gun. He becomes a patient enemy, working in darkness, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Isaiah died on April 15th, 1851, beaten to death on church steps for the crime of being human. 8 months later, 67 people died on Christmas morning when that same church collapsed during service. The two events were officially unconnected. But everyone in the enslaved community of Natchez understood the connection, understood that time and patience had transformed grief into action. Understood that Christmas morning was not an accident, but an answer. An answer delivered by a father who loved his son enough to spend 8 months carefully, methodically, patiently preparing the perfect vengeance. An answer that said, "You can take everything from us, but you cannot take our ability to fight back. You cannot take our humanity. You cannot take our will to resist. And in the end, that's what makes Samuel's story matter. Not because violence solved anything. The church was rebuilt. Slavery continued for another 12 years in Mississippi. Rebecca and Samuel lived and died in bondage. But for one moment, on one Christmas morning, the oppressed struck back with precision and power. For one moment, the masters became victims, and the slaves became architects of justice. For one moment, the natural order was overturned, and white people learned that black people were not animals or property or simple creatures. They were humans capable of extraordinary planning, capable of patience, capable of turning the tools of civilization against those who wielded them with such cruelty. Samuel spent 8 months weakening the foundations of that church. But in doing so, he weakened something much larger, the myth of black powerlessness. He proved that given time and determination, the oppressed could strike back in ways their oppressors never imagined. And that proof, that demonstration, echoed far beyond Natchez, far beyond Mississippi, far beyond 1851. It became part of the hidden history of resistance, part of the secret knowledge passed down through generations, part of the understanding that sustained people through another 12 years of slavery and 100 years of Jim Crow and all the struggles that followed. Because Samuel's story said something that enslaved people desperately needed to hear. You are not powerless. You are not helpless. You are capable of resistance, of planning, of striking back. And if you are patient enough, careful enough, committed enough, you can make your oppressors pay. The Christmas massacre of 1851 killed 67 people in 12 seconds. But its real impact lasted generations, a secret reminder that justice, even cold and terrible justice, was possible. That patience was a weapon. That love for a murdered child could be transformed into a force powerful enough to bring down God's house and everyone in it. Samuel died in 1874, 23 years after that Christmas morning. His final words, according to those who were with him, were, "Isaiah, I'm coming to see Isaiah." Perhaps he hoped for forgiveness. Perhaps he hoped his son would understand why he'd done what he'd done. Perhaps he hoped that somewhere beyond death, there was a justice that didn't require 67 corpses to balance the scales. But whatever Samuel hoped, whatever peace he found or didn't find, he left behind a story that refuses to be forgotten. A story that white America tried to erase and black America preserved in whispers. A story about a father's love and a father's vengeance. A story about patience and precision and the lengths to which a human being will go when everything they love is taken from them. The church came down at 11:47 a.m. on Christmas morning, 1851. 67 people died. And Samuel, the enslaved carpenter who'd spent 8 months carefully preparing their deaths, stood in a grove of trees and watched justice fall from heaven like the fist of an angry God. That's the story. That's the truth. That's what happened when they killed a man's son and thought there would be no consequences. Remember his name. Samuel. Remember his son's name. Isaiah. Remember that even in the darkest chapter of American history, even under the most complete oppression, people found ways to fight back, found ways to resist, found ways to prove that humanity cannot be completely crushed, that the human spirit, when pushed to its absolute limit, transforms into something that oppressors should fear. Because Samuel proved that patience is more powerful than violence, that intelligence is more dangerous than strength, that a carpenter with 8 months and absolute commitment can kill more people than an army with guns. He proved that the appearance of powerlessness can be a disguise for patient, careful, deadly resistance. And he proved that there is no crime so terrible that it will not be answered, no child whose death will not be avenged, no injustice so accepted by society that someone, somewhere, won't decide that the price needs to be paid. The Christmas Massacre of 1851. 67 dead. One father's vengeance. And a lesson that echoes through history. Push people too far, and they will find a way to push back.